Despite this cold, which I am thoroughly nurturing this weekend, I'm sorry if I cough on you today, I am just bursting with such a deep sense of gratitude for the connections that we have together as the family of Christ, particularly here in our community, to have had this relationship with MBF for 30 years, to have known Andy for quite a few years now. And also, a couple summers ago, my wife and I were on our sabbatical, and we went to preach at the American church in Paris. And I was going to interview their head of staff, Scott Herr, after church. And so we did that up in Scott's apartment. And my family was looking for something to do. And their associate pastor, Vance and Mia, welcomed my wife and our kids into their apartment for the entire afternoon and entertained us at a drop of a hat, what is that? Drop of a hat, yeah. And it was just a wonderful day, and they had such a deep connection. Well, fast forward a couple of years, our church is very good friends with First Pres Santa Monica, and they have finally called a new pastor, and it's Vance from the American church in Paris. So Vance and Mia, why don't you all stand up real quickly? Great to have you here. Welcome. Anything you need to know restaurants, good dry cleaners, talk to any of us. We'll be, but so good to have you here this morning. The scientists refer to it as Friggatriskaidekaphobia. And the question is whether you have it or not. They say that 19 million Americans suffer from it at least a little bit. It is the technical term for what is known as a fear of the date, Friday the 13th. Economists reckon that every time the 13th of the month aligns with a Friday, the American economy loses $1 billion. Can you believe it? In lost revenue from people who refuse to go into work, to close a business deal, to even get on a plane or go shopping. We all have our fears. The question is, what is yours? So I want you to take a second to turn to the person next to you and tell them one of your phobias or fears. Are you ready? On your marks, get set, go. All right. Have you found some good ones? I have a couple of what you would call those irrational fears. For one thing, I hate spiders. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I think it has something to do with the way that they walk, but they just creep me out. I also have a fear of heights. A fear of heights. You know, not exactly. I'm not afraid to be on an airplane. I'm not afraid to be up on top of a tall building. I'm just more afraid of getting really close to the edge of a height. If I do, my hands start to sweat, my toes curl, and for some reason, I can't stop myself from imagining myself throwing myself over the edge and falling to an untimely death. I'm also a little bit claustrophobic, although I'm not sure if it's really claustrophobic, because I'm okay in a crowded elevator. When I went in 9th grade and was on the grass seats for the Who concert, I was fine. But when my wife and I went on our honeymoon and we were down in South Africa, we went to the Kango Caves. And when they went on the tour, we all had an opportunity to climb through what they called the Devil's Mail Slot. Now, I should have known. I mean, there could be no safer place in the whole world. It's probably safer than being in my own bed at night. And yet, right when I was in the middle of that, all I could think about was the miles of rock above me and the miles of rock below me, and I had a full-on panic attack. My heart started racing. I could barely breathe. I was scared out of my wits. Now, some of our fears are irrational, but of course, other fears are very rational. I want to be really clear that fear is a normal human emotion. It is a good thing. It's something that God has given us to keep us safe. You should be scared of certain things. You should be scared not to pay your taxes or to pay them in full. You ought to be scared of getting too close to the edge of a cliff. You should be scared of eating that seafood curry from your favorite Thai restaurant that you went to last week. The leftovers. Sorry. There are a lot of fears that we have, and while some of them are irrational, others are very rational. Our fears keep us from doing stupid things. There was an article up in Portland about a man, I don't know if you saw this, who had to be rushed to the hospital because he put a rattlesnake in his mouth to try to impress his friends. Well, it bit him, and weeks later, when he was finally recovered, the newspaper reporters interviewed him, and he said, you know, for the most part, it was a pretty stupid thing to do. You think? For the most part? Mostly? How about it was completely a stupid thing to do? Our fears, all of us have fears, and while some are irrational, others are rational, but whether they're rational, irrational, or some combination of both, I think that what we find is that most of the time our fears get in the way of the things that we want to do and need to do, of becoming the people that we want to become. Isn't that right? And I have been wanting to preach a sermon series on this for a while now because I believe that in recent years, you and I have been living in, and I think you'll agree with me, in an age of increased anxiety and fears. Isn't that right? I think right now, for most of us, what we would agree to is that many of our national policies, many of our individual habits, many of our global trends are being driven by the fears that we have in our lives. Isn't that true? Fear does terrible things to us. And so this next number of weeks, we're going to be talking about some of our fears. We're going to be dissecting and exploring some of the typical fears that run rampant in our lives and in our world today. We'll be talking about things like fear of change and fear of failure, fear of the other and the stranger, fear of death, fear of not having enough, not doing enough, not being enough. My friend Rich Conwisher, over last spring when I was doing research on this sermon series, I came across a series that my friend Rich Conwisher did in Peachtree in Atlanta. And I have to say that all of my sermons are really nothing more than a conglomeration of other people's thoughts and ideas and sermons I've read and talks I've listened to and articles that I've seen and chapters of books that I love, a good Tom Toole story or Tony Campolo story mixed with some of my own thoughts and my own questions and my own stories. But this sermon series was so good that I feel like I need to say that a lot of what you're going to be hearing over these next couple of weeks in my sermons have been drawn heavily from Rich's excellent sermon series on this subject. So thank you, Rich. I really appreciate it. Rich is on the board of directors of his college, Trinity College in San Antonio, Texas. And last year at one of their board meetings, the leaders of the university were raising a concern that over the last 6 years, the counseling appointments booked by students in their college had actually more than doubled. And what they were finding that was most telling is that 6 years ago, when the kids would come in for counseling, it was mostly having to do with issues around depression. But today, the vast majority of those coming in were to deal with their issues with anxiety and fear. They say that the majority of most Americans are dealing with either a moderate, severe, or debilitating level of anxiety in their lives. And I don't know if that is you today or not, but what I want to do today is to begin this conversation of What are these fears? What is the underlying reason for these fears? How do they affect us? And what can we do to stand up to them so that we can keep them from paralyzing us, from debilitating us, keep us from living the life that God has created us to live? And so I'd like to begin with a story that comes from the book of Numbers. It is the story after the Exodus, after the Israelites have spent 2 years wandering around in the Sinai Peninsula through the wilderness, and they finally arrive at Kadesh Barnea. It is a small little area just about 1 mile away from the river that separates the Sinai Peninsula, the wilderness, from the Promised Land. This is the place that they have spent their lives trying to get to. This was the place that God had promised them. It is the fulfillment of everything that they have been hoping and dreaming for, really, since the time of Abraham. And so they're right there on the edge of everything that they've been waiting for. And Moses gets the people together, sends 12 of them out into the Promised Land as spies to sort of do reconnaissance and try to figure out what's going on there before they go to invade. And 40 days later, there's that number, 40 again, they come back and they all say, it is as good as we thought it was going to be. They carry with them pomegranates and figs. 2 of them are carrying a bunch of grapes that's so big it takes 2 men carrying it on a pole to bring it across the river. They say it is everything that we have ever hoped and dreamed for, but there is no way we can go in there. Moses and the people are like, what? Says, the people over there, they're too big. They're tall, like really, really tall. Some of the translations say they are giants. And their cities are too big, and their cities are too fortified. There is no way that we will be able to beat them if we go in there. And the only one who brings up any sort of argument against it is Caleb. And so we pick up the story where Caleb speaks out. Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said, the land we explored, it devours those living in it. Okay, that's pretty serious. It devours the people living in it. All the people we saw there were of great size. Again, a lot of the versions say, were giants. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked like grasshoppers to them. That night, all of the members of the community raised their voices, and they wept aloud. All of the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Are you kidding me? Do you remember what their occupation was in Egypt? Oh yeah, they were slaves. And they said to each other, we should choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid. Our fears, they keep us from doing things, becoming things. that we know we need to do, that we know we need and want to become. There are a few things out of this story that I think illustrates to us some of the typical things that our own fears do to us. The first is that our fears cause us to forget the past. I mean, let's remember, these are the people who had escaped from the largest, most terrifying kingdom and army in all of the ancient world at the time. They had watched the way that God had brought the 10 plagues upon Egypt. They had watched as God parted the waters of the Red Sea for them to walk through and then crashed the waves over Pharaoh's army. These were the people who had been led by a pillar of fire at night and a cloud pillar by the day. These people had watched as God had rained down on them manna from heaven for them to eat. And yet here they are on the very edge, the very precipice of everything they've been waiting for, everything that they wanted in life. And they're terrified to go over because of the giants. I don't know if you have experienced the same thing, the way that your fears cause you to forget what God has done for you in the past. That you've been through tough times and God has been there for you, that you were able to trust God. But then you come up to a new scary thing and suddenly it's like none of those things have ever happened before and you forget that God was ever there in the first place. Our fears cause us to forget the past. They also cause us to exaggerate or distort the present. When they came back, I mean, I'm sure that the people over there in the Promised Land were kind of tall. But by the time they got back to Moses, they had become giants. Isn't that like all of our fears? That as we dwell on them, they become bigger, our obstacles become giants in our own eyes? There's an acronym that they often use for fear, that it's false evidence appearing real. I like that. Our fears are false evidence appearing real. There was another story that came out of Arkansas. A woman was sitting in her car in her grocery store's parking lot when all of a sudden she heard this extremely loud bang right behind her. And then she felt this searing hot pain on the back of her head. She had no idea what had happened. What had actually happened is one of those Pillsbury dough canisters from the market was sitting on top of one of her bags of groceries. And the light was coming in through her back window in a way that it heated up the canister so that it exploded and all of the dough went flying against the back of her head. And yet she had no idea what was happening and she was totally panicking, so she started screaming, "Help me, help me!" A person came over and said, "Are you okay?" She said, No, I'm not okay. I've been shot. Someone shot me, and now I'm trying to hold my brains into the back of my head." False evidence appearing real. Our fears have a way of distorting and exaggerating what's going on in the present, and then they have a way of boxing us out of what our future is supposed to be. Our fears cause us to be paralyzed, to not know how to move forward. They keep us from taking risks that we ought to take, trying new things that we need to try. In these last years, I think ever since 9/11, and then the great economic recession of 2008, I think we've allowed ourselves to become afraid, haven't we? The people of Israel had spent 2 years, had gone through thick and thin to get there to the edge of the Promised Land, and yet they were afraid to go in. And so God allows all of them, an entire generation of Israelites, to stay there for 38 more years until they pass away so that the next generation will enter into the Promised Land. Some of our fears are individual, and the consequences in our lives can be huge. But other fears are communal or corporate, aren't they? An entire generation, which can destabilize the entire globe. So what can we do? What can we do to face our fears and to overcome them, or at least not allow them to manipulate and control and paralyze our lives? Well, the first thing I think we can do is slow down. Isn't it true that the speed in our lives causes our fears to grow unchecked? That as we're rushing around with these hectic lives over the tips of our skis at all times, that it allows our giants to become bigger in our head. We need to slow down and to name what our fears are, and then to start to understand what are the fears underneath the fears of what we're going through. Because as we start to see our fears for what they are, as we start to ask the question, what am I so scared of? What is the worst that could happen here? What is the fear underneath the fear? They begin to dissipate. The next thing we can do is pray. The book of Philippians, as Laura read as part of the prayer of confession, it says, "Do not be anxious or afraid for anything, but in everything present your requests to God in prayer, and the peace of God will guard your heart and your mind." Prayer and fear are similar in that they both take up the same real estate, the same bandwidth in our hearts and our minds. The truth is, you can't pray and be anxious or worried at the same time. Because prayer is a form of meditation, and worry is a form of meditation when you really stop to think about it. It's just meditation on the wrong things. If you bring your fears to God in prayer, there is no more room for you to be anxious or worried about them. The next thing we can do is we can go and allow somebody in. You may go and seek professional help, or you may just turn to a friend or a pastor or the church or your community or a family member. Once again, when we were little kids, it was the dark that made our fears bigger and scarier, right? When the lights went out, all of a sudden that monster under our bed seemed twice the size that it did when the lights were on. When we bring our fears to one another and we share it with others, it has a way of taking the fear out of what's going on, doesn't it? I've talked to so many of you who have gone through some of the scariest things in your entire lives, and you have said, if it wasn't for this community, I don't think I would have made it through those days. It's one of the most beautiful things about this church, the way that you surround each other and come to each other in your times of need. We're not always able to fix it. We're not able to take the fear away, but just having someone to listen to you and to walk beside you, it has a way of reducing our fears, doesn't it? And then finally, the thing I would say most of all, allow yourself to run into God's arms. You know those 41 times, there are 41 times in the Bible that God commands us, do not be afraid. But the other phrase, which is paired with that command more than any other, is simply the phrase, for I am with you. Isaiah, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Oh, sorry, this is the, I went through. Can you skip it over to the Isaiah? Okay, there we go. There. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. Again, God isn't always able to fix the problems. Cancer usually remains cancer. Divorces usually remain divorces. And yet the fear is taken away when we allow God to put God's arms around us, when we remember that we are dearly loved and that we are never alone, that God goes with us into the scariest, most fearful moments of our entire lives. 1 John puts it like this: God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. Perfect love drives out fear. A number of years ago, Stanford University, a number of biologists did a study where they took this machine that was very imposing looking. It had all sorts of buzzers and bells and flashing lights on it, and they put it in a cage with baby monkeys in order to try to scare them. I guess that's what they do for fun at Stanford University. But what they found, the same thing happened every time without fail. These little baby monkeys, they would be terrified of this machine, and they would run screaming and yelling back into the arms of their moms. But the minute they got into their mom's clutches, they would turn around with a fierce face. All of a sudden, they were brave and courageous, and they'd start lashing out at the machine and making all these threatening gestures. The danger hadn't gone away, but suddenly in their mother's arms, the mother couldn't fix it, but in their mother's arms, where they knew that they were loved, where they knew that they were not alone, all of a sudden it gave them all of the courage in the world. Allow yourself to be swept up in God's unconditional love for you, and it will do a number on the fears in your life. I guarantee you. Allow God to wrap God's arms around you, and you will find a courage and a freedom that will make your fears begin to vanish. Fear is normal. It's what we do with our fears that matters. You allow yourself to be loved by the God who created you and will never leave you alone, the God who longs to be at your side through all you go through in this life. And suddenly that commandment to be not afraid starts to feel a whole lot more like a promise. Amen.